I'm just back from Cuba, and I wasn't planning on making a video while I was there. I actually wasn't even planning on making one until I got back. But I kind of realized like a lot of the stuff that I had read about and saw in YouTube videos was somewhat accurate, but not quite as accurate as, or at least not to the same observations that I had. And I tend to be a little less touristy in my travels, so perhaps maybe that had something to do with the differences. So the first thing I kind of want to mention is Wi-Fi, which is talked about a lot. It is very, very limited. Some people have Wi-Fi in their homes, some don't. My Airbnb hosts did, but they didn't give us direct access, but we had access to the router, which allowed us to go out and buy the cards, which are about $5 an hour. I'm sorry, $5 for 5 hours, which you have to go buy. And you have to wait in lines, which is pretty typical of Cuba. You have to wait in line. You just have to accept it. That's the way it is. So we got the 5-hour card, which was a little bit tricky on the phones because for some reason we couldn't figure out how to turn it off. But when I used my laptop, that didn't seem to be a problem. And what I did is I set up like a mobile hotspot, so my family could use that. Even though I think the router, I think once I connected, they all could connect to that as well. So it is spotty. It's not going to be great for uploading and downloading videos. It is good for maybe checking your email, maybe posting some things to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, but pretty limited, and it may not always be working, which is typical of a lot of things. So food is a really interesting thing. It is hit or miss. Now, we did do a lot of TripAdvisor recommendations, and they tended to be pretty accurate. The TripAdvisor restaurants that were highly rated were pretty good. And also our Airbnb host also suggested a few restaurants, and they tended to be good too. But everything else is really, really hit or miss. So you may go into a restaurant that's it looks really great, but you end up waiting for maybe a very long time, and the food is really marginal. So you probably want to go on recommendations. Having said that, food in itself obviously is somewhat different in terms of diet, but you will have to wait a long time. And part of that reason that you're going to have to wait a long time is that they tend to pick vegetables and things fresh, especially if it's a small restaurant in a neighborhood, which we went to one of them, and they told us like we couldn't have the plantains because it had just rained really heavily, and they were just too watery. So I think some of these smaller shops, when we say sourced locally, we mean like farms. When they mean sourced locally, they mean through like their neighbors. So this one restaurant, like we had to wait a really, really long time. We had chicken, and I think they literally went to a neighbor's house that raised chickens and killed one. And one of the reasons for that, it might sound kind of demeaning to a country, but they don't have great refrigeration. Electricity isn't always 100%, and there's several other reasons, but it does keep the food very, very fresh. So the vegetables may be from 2 or 3 houses down the road, or somebody brings it into the restaurant that they work at. So you do get very fresh foods for the most part. I don't know what the safety is in terms of restaurants not getting better food that maybe has gone bad, but we didn't really have any problems. In fact, we didn't even get sick from water, which is an issue. People don't have potable water. If you're fairly poor, it's not consistent. So even in our very nice apartment, for instance, we did run out of water for showers and things. But we also drank a lot of bottled water, which is really popular with tourists, but also just a lot of regular people, if they can afford the $1 or so for the bottled water. You probably will spend $2 to $3, depending on which restaurants you go to, because you are a tourist. They see that you're a tourist. And I've actually had several places that would clearly on the menu it would be like $1 or $2, and they would overprice me. Overcharge me, and that's just the way it is. And you can make a scene, but or maybe you can just say, well, it's at $2, but for the most part, I just let it go. Another thing you're going to find is, like the last day we were there, we were looking for just some quick like pizza or something. And the pizza's quite wonderful. But we went to this one place and we thought we could take it out, but it was actually sit down. So we sat down. It was a little longer than we wanted to spend, but it's because it was a pizza place. We had already sat. We ordered the pizza. Now it was $3.50, and what I thought was a little pricey for Cuba because it was with the topping. It was a dollar extra for that, but it was like $3.50. Seemed a little bit pricey, but really cheap for the United States. But what I didn't expect is they brought me an entire pizza, like a 12 or 14 inch, more than like a personal pizza. So kind of beware, if the price seems a little high, it might, for Cuba, it might not be high. It might just be that you're getting a lot more than you've ever expected. But I'm not a foodie, but I found it pretty easy to get decent food. Some of the restaurants that we were told that were good were quite good. Some of the hole-in-the-wall places were really hit or miss. I went into a few places that were really for locals and had pretty good luck, but you don't, unless you speak Spanish, you may not know what exactly you're getting. Chicken is very different. The two main ingredients that they have for meat are chicken and pork. There is some steak, but I think it's really mostly for tourists. And I didn't want to look like the ugly American and start eating hamburgers and steaks and things like that, even though you can get like a steak for like $12, which would have been like $25 US. And these are in like the nicer restaurants. But for the most part, chicken and eggs are really popular, and pork is also popular. And I think it's because even in the city, people have chickens running around or in pens. And it's just, it's a convenient thing that people can do. So they're not going to go to a grocery store the way we are. They're going to go they're going to get grains and things like that. And using grains, of course, you can convert that into meat by buying chickens. And I'm not sure where the pork is raised, but I think it's locally. But there isn't a lot of fields of cows. Now I went and got several guides through Airbnb. I bought them in advance, or bought their services in advance, and I had a great time with them. The first one, David, spoke pretty good English. He took me into Central City, which is far less touristy and a lot more real. As he said, that's where the bulk of the people really live. And that was really a wonderful experience. And I'm a photographer, so a street photographer. I didn't know what the etiquette was for taking pictures of people. I didn't speak the language. So I was very uncomfortable even pulling out my camera, even for safety. I wasn't sure how safe it was. So I hired him on the first day I was there. He was actually a senior telecommunications engineer. And he said he actually made more money through these Airbnb tours, which I think this one was around $28 for maybe 3 hours. But it is hot. We went in August, which is not a great time, so definitely carry water, but of course water gets heavy, so you want to start off with at least carrying one, and then you could probably buy one or a soft drink or something on the way. The national soda is better than imported. I don't know if the restaurants prefer selling the national Cuban soda, because I think it might be less profit for them, but I prefer to even soft drinks. So we went and did that. The beers are pretty good. There's only 3 major ones. I can't remember. Crystal was the cheap one. Bucanero, I think, was the heaviest beer. And then there was another one which I had, which I can't remember the name offhand, but it was like a medium beer, and that was the one that I and my wife both seemed to enjoy. So my wife and my son, they like to do more touristy things, and I like to do more in the city type of things with people. So I did the second tour, which was support of the people, but it was actually really just a tour. They customized it to me, and it was just me and this one other person, as it was with the first tour. And really, you can give a lot of history of the city. A lot of people that give these tours, the 2 qualifications, the 3 qualifications is 1, being personable, 2, knowing the city, and where to go, and 3, the history of the city. So there were both the 2 tours I took in that regard were really good. And then we did a third tour, which was so good that I wanted my wife to come back, because we actually went into people's homes And many of these people are really, really poor, such as a mother that was about 70 years old, I'm willing to say, with maybe her 40, 45-year-old son, who lived upstairs in a 10 by 12 room. And they had converted this very tall space into a second floor, which is where the son slept, with one partial bathroom. They were excited because they had had water there all week, which she said in 48 years. It rarely has ever happened to them. But it was like the kitchen / bathroom, and it was literally the size of my closet. So it was a great tour because you really get to see how a lot of the people live. There was what I would call a middle class, which is probably the bulk of the people, but there's a lot of poor people or people that actually have some money, but it's really, really hard to find new housing. So you can't just go in and say, I'm making more money now, I'm doing these Airbnbs and I want to find a new house. That's just not going to be possible. So you're going to go in this tour went into some really, really poor people's homes. But it was really interesting to see how people lived. And the tour guide actually gives them a kook, which is about the equivalent of $1. To them, it's a way to make money, is to kind of show their house and to talk. And most of the people, one of the people, we went into their house. This tour guide had never been in before, and I was a little nervous, and I think she might have been. But the person turned out to be really nice and charming, and wanted to show us his place. So again, his whole room was probably, him and his wife, was maybe 10 by 12, and this one actually had no windows whatsoever. So people really stay outside a lot because first off, it's really hot indoors, and secondly, they don't have air conditioning. Though in that same building, some people lived in those same houses had built-in air conditioners in the walls. So I think that was a situation where they were able to obtain some money, but could not get a new apartment. So they just had to stay there. But access is an issue. So you'll see things like cars that you have to push to start because the starter motor's gone, and the person has money to buy the starter, but they just can't get such a thing. The infrastructure in this city is kind of shockingly broken down, and not just infrastructure, but buildings themselves. It's really apparent once you get in there, but don't, even in half-decent buildings, be careful about railings and stairs because a lot of them could break at any time. Electricity, everybody they get free apartments, but at least a lot of the people do. Some people actually own their own apartments, such as the Airbnb we stayed in. But there's this wiring like all over the place, not done by any electrician. It would be a condemned building anywhere in the United States. In fact, one of the buildings we went into, the backside had actually completely collapsed. The state sealed off the back door with bricks, took away all the debris, and let people still stay in the part of the building that was structurally still there. It probably wasn't sound, but apparently 2 or 3, an American architect who does restoration told me that 2 or 3 buildings in Havana do collapse per day, and I'm not sure how many people perish in those building fires and collapses, but apparently there are some. Another thing with the roads is they're really crowded with people. Old Havana is just filled with tourists, mostly Australian, a lot of Latin American people from South America and Central America go to Havana. But there's bicycles all over the place, and the drivers of cars tend to be pretty good, even though it might look chaotic, because they don't want any damage to their cars because getting repairs are really difficult. I would strongly recommend you do not rent a car for several reasons. One of them, I've heard that if you are in an accident, you have to stay in the country until the process of the paperwork and such has been completed. And you also have a very high chance of hurting somebody because there's not a lot of crosswalks, so people are all over the place. And I think if you're accustomed to that, you're much more careful. But as an American or maybe even a European, there's a very high chance you could hurt somebody. So I would strongly recommend that you not rent a car. as for being a tourist, you're going to walk all over the place. Everybody's going to spot you as a tourist. I could not prevent that because I was carrying a fairly expensive camera with me, and it was just obvious tourist. So even the tour guides I were on, one of them was a photo tour, two of them were photo tours, and they had cameras, and they lived in Havana their whole life. But with the camera, they looked like a tourist, so people would always stop them. One of them told me, like, a lot of times people will ask to have their picture taken, but they'll say like one kook, which is like $1. I don't pay in advance. I won't do that. I will be respectful if somebody says not to take my picture. However, like David, one of my tour guides, would always ask a question like, well, like why? And people would just be friendly and say, oh, okay, no problem. But a lot of people were actually really fine with me taking a picture. Maybe it's because I had a professional level camera. It wasn't just a cell phone, so they thought maybe I was, they'd be someplace, famous magazine or something. And in fact, one of the houses that we went to that was the 10 by 12 room was this woman and her son. She had been taking photographs. Photographs have been taken of her by journalists from like all over the country, all over the world. And she was actually she'd be showing me the pictures. She'd be like Italy, France, Germany, and in fact there was one newspaper magazine picture of her, and she had that kind of like on her wall. She was like really proud of that. So the German professional photographer sent it to her. So photography is interesting, and the city is just photo porn for taking pictures. I mean, everything's a photo opportunity. I like to take pictures of people. I got comfortable talking to people and asking them if I could take their pictures really up close, with a zoom lens, so I can get a portrait. And for the most part, most people were fine with it. Some people would say no, and I'd be respectful and not take it. The one thing I would not do, I might take a picture of a business, which a lot of times is the front of somebody's house. I might take a picture of them in that. There's a lot of open doors to houses. I would never put my camera into somebody's house and take a picture, except for the houses that we were invited into. And we would ask, that was kind of part of the deal that they were going to get paid by the tour guide. But I would never just do that. I would just find that really, really disrespectful. So that was something I was really, really cautious of doing. Talking to people, even with very little language, I would just point to my camera and point to their face, and a lot of people were like, yes, please, and they usually do a thumbs up, which is kind of a very universal language and very, very helpful for that. One of the things that was like a real shock and surprise to me was the amount of feral dogs and cats. They are everywhere, and cats, you can go up and pat. They tend to be fairly friendly. Dogs might be friendly, but because dogs bite, I just would not go and pat a dog. So I would always wash my hands after patting cats, but they really, really are sleeping under motorcycles, any kind of shade. They eat, pretty much garbage, so they are alley cats and will stay by garbage bins. My son really loved the cats, so he actually brought some food to some of them. But a lot of them are very friendly and just amazing photos, just because they would be like on a doorstep in this beautiful big building. So I would just take a picture of the whole building with the cat, maybe looking at me or sleeping. Same thing with dogs all over the place, but a lot of people actually have dogs in the city. So sometimes it's hard to tell what's a feral dog. Usually they would put a collar on a regular dog. But there was a lot of like pugs and smaller dogs that were clearly pets. Some more aggressive dogs for safety, but I think for the most part they were tied down. But I think they were definitely pets and not they didn't just pick up a feral dog. Where I think some people just find a feral cat and take it home and it becomes a pet. So some cats are kind of rescued, but none of them are fixed. Even my very middle class Airbnb host had a cat. That was definitely not fixed, and it was very, very friendly, and it came into our house, and my son and I really enjoyed having that cat there, and it was clean, so we were comfortable with it. But the cats actually have a beauty to it. But the city itself is very, very photogenic. But I still, at least Old Havana, but it's like a combination of Very, very, very old Spanish architecture, more modern influenced, maybe 1910, 1920, maybe some Art Deco architecture, even up to like the 1950s, and then 1970s and 80s, particularly 70s, Russian brutalist functional buildings for a lot of skyscrapers. Very, very few individual homes. I only saw, I think, one of them in the city when I was there, and it was very small, but it was very, very well kept up. So I think they've kind of scored and said that I didn't pay more than an apartment, but they definitely kept that up. But our apartment, for instance, was on the 7th floor with a 270-degree view between the windows and the balcony, and it was pretty spectacular. We'll be posting pictures and some video of that. What surprised me was that it is a very touristy area, Old Havana, and this is not new. David, my first tour guide, said this is actually something, tourism has been part of Havana for 100 years. And even though the United States has just recently started having tours or allowing people into the city or into the country, there's a lot of Australians and a lot of Europeans, French mostly, but I think the bulk of the people I saw that did not speak Spanish were speaking English, and they tend to be Australian. So not a whole lot of Americans, though I did meet some Americans, and I did meet and had a long conversation with somebody who owned a small airline with several planes, who was from Nassau in the Bahamas, and he had a family of 9 there. His daughter was just about to start college in Cuba because it was medical school, and he spent a lot of time in the United States, so he was basically speaking to somebody from the United States for me. So we did buy some art while we were there. We were concerned about taking art back, just the logistics of it. So we kept, I think the largest piece we got was maybe like 2 by 3 feet large, but it's really easy to get pretty, in my opinion, half decent art for a few $100s. I think the most expensive thing we bought was $80, but we found like this artist who, he had like all this fairly tacky tourist stuff, pictures of like Jimi Hendrix and Bob Marley and the tacky stuff. But then he showed me his stuff, the stuff that's from his heart, and some of it was pretty good. And the piece I really liked was just too large to bring back, and it was kind of 3-dimensional multimedia art. So you can find some good art, and it definitely helps the people. The artist that I found that I liked the most, I think his name was like Ernesto Villanova, though it was pronounced in the Spanish way, and I can't remember offhand how to pronounce it. He had actually had art shows like all over the United States, and his least expensive thing there was $700 on American. That was his least expensive. So there are some pretty serious artists there, but a lot of them are just trying to make money. And if you see some touristy art that doesn't appeal to you, but it looks like the style is good, you might want to ask them, do you have any of your own art? And you'll uncover that, and you'll see these gems of art at reasonable prices, probably under $200, probably most of it under $100, which is quite a bit for them because the state pays, if you have a regular job, about $25 to top end around $100 a month for a salary. So even my first tour guide, he said he makes a lot more money doing these Airbnb tours, but he was a senior telecommunications engineer, and he really said he really liked his job, but he only made about $60 a month. But I think you get your apartment for free, and there's some other perks for having a job. And but he was really a street photographer at heart, and it was kind of his weekend passion. But he said he did make more money. So what surprised me, there is land ownership, or at least apartment ownership. I don't think you own the land, but there's some strict rules about owning your own apartment, but a lot of people do, so they tend to fix them up nicely, and it's pretty long. I think they live there indefinitely, but I don't think you can own the actual land. So there are a lot of small businesses. So and even like waiters and waitresses, wait staff make probably more money doing this than they do in their day jobs. So it's definitely a different type of economy. So just be mindful of that. That what sounds like is not a lot of money is actually helping them quite a bit. Um, the cars are. You always see the pictures of all the old 1950s American cars. There are a lot of them, but a lot of them have been converted to taxis and for sightseeing and things, which is again, it's a small business. But that's about, I'm going to say 10% of the cars. The bulk of the cars are like 1970s and 80s Russian-built Ladas, LADA, and other Russian cars. A lot of Peugeots. I was told that the French had a lot of connections there in the 1990s. A lot of MGs, which used to be British, but apparently now the Chinese own them. So there's a lot of Chinese vehicles, but they're still kind of limited. Most people can't have them. And I was told, I can't verify this, but the government kind of limits the amount of cars that can come into the country because too many cars will create issues with the price of gas. Supply and demand plays out in communist countries even when it comes to international purchases. And they would have to do more for the infrastructure if they were to have more cars, more crosswalks, things like that. And so it's the cars are very different. I actually kind of like a lot of these mid-70s European cars because a lot of them were not ones that were sold in the United States. So they were kind of interesting. But even like the taxi that we took from the airport to Old Havana, the car, he had to go out and help somebody push start their car because the starter motor was gone. And I don't think that was an issue of this not having the money to buy the starter, because the cab drivers make fairly good money. I think it really has to do with access. So people do what they can with what little they have, because it's not always money. It's frequently just they can't get the part. They can't get certain things that we have. There are some scary things, like one person, we went to their house and talked to them, and he takes old lighters, the plastic lighters, and he has like all these parts from them. They recycle every part of it, but the way he refueled it was to use some sort of pesticide, which has like a butane propellant. So I think you're working with really high toxic materials all day that are not meant to be handled this way, and I don't know if they're separated before they're put into the lighters. So the lighters, I wouldn't buy a used lighter. Let's put it this way. In Cuba, I would probably just use matches. Not a lot of regular people smoke cigars, and the population for cigarettes is a lot like the United States. A lot of people smoke when they're young, but they don't. They quit at one point. They do realize the health risks. Even things like cars. If they had seatbelts, people would frequently use the seatbelts, even though there's no law for it. There's no law for anything in cars. Cars, if it runs and it has a license plate, they can do anything they want to it. So there's a lot of all the pollution controls have been taken out to get better fuel economy. The cars are not always very safe, but a lot of them are just old and don't have the safety that we're used to. So just kind of go with it and trust that the driver won't be in a bad accident, because they're very careful, because again, with access, they can't fix these cars if they're in an accident, so or fix them as well as they were. So they make well with what they can do. Far less, a lot of restaurants we went to, they did not use paper napkins. They would recycle ones, but more and more of that is going away, and people are using paper and recycle, not reusable plastics. But there are no recycle bins. So if that's a concern of yours, try to go to restaurants that serve out of glasses. Though bottled water, you will have to drink bottled water. We didn't get sick with the water, but we were very careful. So potable water is an issue in the country, and even people that live there told us they boil their water. At least the middle class people. I'm not sure if the poorer people have that kind of access. They collect their water into barrels. And even the really nice apartment we stayed in ran out at one point for a few hours of water for even showers and toilets. Speaking of toilets, do not flush your paper down the toilet. It's really hard to remember that. You have to put it in a garbage bin. The facility for processing water cannot take paper. So that's a little uncomfortable, having to throw it in a barrel. It didn't smell in our house, even though I was kind of surprised because it is warm. We had really good air conditioning, but we turned it off when we were not there. So it's the tropics, and I've lived in the tropics before. Things spoil very, very quickly. Other things that I want to talk about, I will come back to.